So absolutely enormous changes to 40k transports today. Regular transports can move and drop the squad after. The Land Raiders assault ramp rule is back, and Primaris and Firstborn restrictions are being lifted, at least on a few models. There's really quite a surprising amount of stuff here, so let's talk about all the changes. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today we're back for another 10th edition update, this time focusing on transport vehicles in Warhammer 40k. Definitely an iconic part of the game, zooming your vehicles around and piling out elite infantry to wade into the foe. I'd argue from the looks of what we've got here, it looks like transports are going to be even more interesting in 10th edition. It does look like a lot of their core mechanics just got a lot more powerful, though of course it might mean that they go up in points a bit. In 9th edition 40k, they've currently been a bit of a mixed bag. I would argue that most of the factions who have transport vehicles have at least one that's relevant though. At the moment I'd say they tend to fall into the category of generally adding more durability than they do speed. The majority of factions that make heavy use of them competitively generally do so to protect a very dangerous unit that's kind of fragile and make sure that it gets the first strike on the enemy rather than the other way round. There really are a ton of examples of that kind of transport in competitive 40k at the moment. World Eaters Rhinos with Khorne Berserkers, Eldar Banshees or Scorpions hiding in Wave Serpents, Votan Sagitors with Berserks, Guard Chimeras with Kazakin, Admech Dune Riders, Sisters Rhinos or Orc Battle Wagons. There's an awful lot of them. Then there's a few fast skimmers that have the open top special rule that things like to shoot things out of, things like Starweavers or Raiders perhaps, and just a few units that like to slingshot their units into battle, the transport moves and the squad gets out, things like Orc Truck Boys or Tau Devilfish. It looks like this has become a bit more of a generalist rule. I'd say that at the moment a lot of transports aren't really having the worst time of it in 40k 9th. It'll be interesting to see how they fare in 10th though, as certainly some of them really struggled. Usually the really expensive ones like Land Raiders and Repulsors just often tended to be pretty bad, just not really a lot of use as a transport vehicle when you're paying for so many extra guns and things that you might or might not want. Today though, Games Workshop has hit us with really quite a lot of changes to transports. For an area of the game that maybe isn't the single most mainstream thing in the world, they have given us a pretty meaty preview. Here's a rough summary of the changes. First up, as mentioned, you can disembark units after transports have moved. You can still shoot after as well, so it's basically like most units getting the Impulsor special rule. Some transports like the Impulsor can advance and then do this as well. The Land Raiders assault ramp allows you to move, disembark and charge now, so pretty fast at getting Terminators actually into the fray. The bigger Space Marine transports like Land Raiders and Repulsors will be able to take both Primaris and Firstborn, though the smaller transports seem to be a bit ambiguous from what Games Workshop have said. They've clarified the firing deck rule, the rules for shooting from vehicles, and we get a bit more clarity as to how that works, and then they've given us several faction-specific examples, a few extra rules for Eldar Guard and Orcs, which are kind of interesting just to look at in isolation. All of this comes against a backdrop of the toughness characteristic of a lot of vehicles going up. It looks like transport vehicles will actually need some very dedicated anti-tank firepower to gun them down. You can't just hope for mass bolter fire at strength 4 to wound a rhino to death. You'll be wounding that on 6s now, not 5s. Broadly speaking, I'd say that will be good news for transport occupants. Perhaps one of the most annoying things about them is having to deal with the first damage profile, then the second, and you might need very different weapons to crack the transport and then kill its occupants. Breaking down the changes one by one, first up we've got confirmation that most transports in the game will allow you to move and then disembark the contents of them. Basically this is the Space Marine Impulsor special rule, but made generalised, and honestly I'm not really too surprised to see this change. Even in the last video when I was speculating a bit about Primaris Transports, I did say that making the Impulsor special rule just a general change to the game could be a fairly good way to actually make transports as to unit speed, which they don't always do all that much currently. Basically with transports moving around, you've got the option of either having the transport stationary, then you can disembark as normal, move, shoot and charge, or you've got the option of the transport moving first, the squad can disembark and then can shoot but it can't charge, similar to how the Impulsor works. In general, for most transports you can't do this if the transport has either advanced and fallen back, though certain fast ones can, as we'll get onto in a second. Overall, I must admit I do quite like this change. It actually adds to the unit's speed now, which feels like it should be one of the purposes of the transport, but they have been kind of lacking with it. A lot of bigger, tougher units often could get to similar kind of speeds as they get from a transport in the first place, just advance each turn if you're not making a charge, and being infantry often could mean that they'd have a lot better interaction with terrain and not have to go around annoying pieces or anything. I feel like this change could actually make transports kind of worth it for just units that are very slow to get them where they need to be. That does seem kind of appropriate for them as to how you'd expect them to function on the tabletop. Otherwise, in particular, this seems like a very big boost to close-range firepower units. Things like Space Marine Hellblasters or Tau Breacher teams could access this rule before, and they both quite liked it to get up close. Could potentially be very powerful for things like Space Marine Eradicators getting up close with their Melter, or Necron Warriors lumbering out of their Ghost Arcs and hitting people very hard at close range with Gauss Reapers. Also could have interesting potential for objective snatchers as well, just cheap squads of troops with high objective control, jumping out of a transport onto an objective a very long way away and stealing it from under the nose of the opponent. I still don't think that this will probably tip the balance too far from ranged units and transports compared with melee ones. I think the Space Marine Impulsor is quite a good example of that. It was still perhaps more often used to transport things like Blade Guard or Assault Intercessors compared with things like Hellblasters. Still, just having a fast battlefield bunker to declare charges out of has a lot of good value for combat units. Overall, I do think the change is quite a good one. Just as an aside to that change as well, GW have clarified that a few transports will be able to advance and do this as well. The Taurox and the Impulsor can both get this. These guys get to advance and then still drop the unit afterwards, again can shoot but not charge. It does say that units that get out this way count as having made a normal move this phase, so I guess that might imply that you wouldn't be able to move after you've got out the transport like this. But still the threat range that you could get out to is pretty big. If the Impulsor's movement characteristic stays the same at 14 inches, you get 14 inches plus d6 advance, potentially up to 20 inches from the transport's ability, then disembarking within 3 inches of it. That would in theory give you a 23 inches maximum threat range in terms of getting a unit out, or around about 20 inches just in terms of average move. To be honest, I guess advancing isn't usually going to be the thing that you want to do with these transport vehicles. You will be giving up their firepower unless the rules for advancing has changed quite a bit. Sometimes though, I guess that extra little bit of movement could well be worth it if it gets your squad onto the target that they need to be. Next up, and I suspect going to be quite a welcome return, is the assault ramp rule to the Land Raider. They certainly needed something after having warmed the shelf for just about all the way throughout 8th and 9th edition. Their core rules have just let them down quite hard, I think. The assault ramp rule basically means that the unit gets to charge after disembark from a Land Raider. So I guess with its normal movement characteristic that would be moved 10 inches, a 3-inch disembark radius at the front of the beast. Then your Terminators would also get to charge 2d6 inches. Again, I would guess that you probably don't get to move before doing so, but still that's a very respectable average charge distance of 20 inches out of a Land Raider, enough to almost jump a Terminator squad from your own deployment zone all the way into your opponent's. You will be able to do so if you roll very well on the charge. Seems pretty excellent, to be honest. That could actually be a reasonable argument for actually fielding a Land Raider once more. Currently they just don't get the unit into charge range that efficiently, so aren't really worth considering for the role of actually speeding up the unit. Overall, again, I think that's a pretty decent change, actually being a good luxury delivery option, as opposed to just not really adding too much besides just taking more Terminators and footslogging them. Next up, we've got the rules for units firing from transports, and that's a rule called Firing Deck, which we saw mentioned briefly on the Rhino datasheet before. This is perhaps just a bit more of a consolidation of rules for units firing out of various hatches and things. The rule is that you'll get Firing Deck X, and then the number of models specified can fire out of the vehicle, basically counting the weapon sort of like it's mounted on the vehicle, rather than being fired by the squad itself. In a previous preview, I saw a bunch of people getting very excited that Games Workshop said it will be X units firing from the top of Rhino. It did seem pretty unlikely to me that they'd be allowing huge squads of Space Marines all to fire out of the top of that one transport. It is confirmed just to be models, not entire units now. Otherwise, for supporting things around the rule, it looks like the models that you can select only gets to fire one ranged weapon from the top of the transport. If they had two, they wouldn't be able to fire more than one still. As mentioned, it counts as being on the transport, so any inherent rules on the unit's ability section I don't think would apply, though you would still use the ballistic skill of the unit in question, as the ballistic skill is mounted on the weapon profile now, not on the actual stat line of the vehicle. I think it means that, say, if you had some Space Marine Hellblasters firing out of an open-topped vehicle, they still host on their regular ballistic skill of 3+, but if they had an attached lieutenant or something, they wouldn't be able to profit from his damage boost if they were firing it out at the top of a vehicle. It might be a bit of a side grade though. While you might not be able to make use of any of the unit's own abilities or character buffs, you will be able to take effect for any buffs affecting the transport. They gave the example of the Orc Mech improving the 2-hit roll, which could help a whole load of units firing from within. Overall, maybe it's not the biggest change compared with how things are at the moment. I guess maybe it just might indicate that there's a bit more scope for just a few models firing out of the top of a transport, like say firing out of the Rhino's top hatches once more, as opposed to just being a bit all or nothing and the entire squad can fire or none of it can. I guess it certainly will change the idea of Rhinos a fair bit. If you're blazing away with missile launchers or melter from the top hatch, it might feel a bit more of a gun bunker than it was, a change that reminds me a bit of 7th edition. They also did drop that the battle wagon for the Orcs will have a firing deck of 22. That does sound pretty excessive, but it basically just means that it's going to get the same amount of firing deck as models that you can transport, I'm sure, so perhaps it's not really quite as impressive as it sounds. Next up, and one of the things that I teased last week, was Primaris and Transports. I did talk about this in a video over the weekend. It basically confirmed that aggressors could ride in Land Raiders, and I had presumed that that would probably mean that you'd have things like Rhinos and Impulsors de-restricted, but it looks like they go out of the way to say that most Primaris and Firstborn transport vehicles won't be locked, but a few exceptions might have some sort of restriction. They didn't absolutely spell this out though, and weren't 100% clear. Perhaps the big news is that things like Repulsors and Land Raiders will be able to transport both Firstborn and Primaris. Really quite fun, I think. It has been something vaguely annoying in Space Marine army construction for a while now, having the range kind of sawn in half along the Firstborn and Primaris lines. There's not really a whole load of logic for it besides keeping the ranges separate. I guess the new units would have their own fighting styles that are quite likely to share the chapter's motor pool, plus there's not really any size arguments you can really make between the Land Raider. If it can hold Terminators, I'm sure it can hold Intercessors. We did get this preview for the Repulsor specifically. This one has a transport capacity of 12 Adeptus Astartes infantry. Nothing about the Primaris keyword there. And then it goes on to say that each jump pack, Wolfen, Gravis or Terminator model takes up the space of 2 models, and each Centurion model takes up the space of 3. Quite a few interesting changes there. First up, the transport capacity going up to 12 is kind of news in itself. Previously it was 10, and that means that you could now have a full squad of 10 Space Marines plus an attached character and still fit them all inside the tank. I certainly would have expected that it would have been able to take Wolfen and Terminators, though maybe jump packs and Centurions were a bit more questionable. It does seem though that the Repulsor is just mirroring the Land Raider in every single way. It's got the same restrictions as the standard Land Raider has at the moment, and I'd kind of guess that as a result the standard Land Raider might go up to capacity 12 as well. While we're on the Repulsor as well, they also gave us the hint to say that the special rule would allow units to dive inside once they're threatened. That itself seems like a really powerful datasheet ability all by itself. The ability just to pick up a unit and hide it inside the transport if they have a charge threat is really quite big. It does seem though that when they're talking about the Primaris transports, they do specifically call out the Rhino, Razorback and Impulsors as an examples. They still say that they're specialised for certain squad types, and it doesn't sound like they're just talking about Gravis Marines there, as they go on to talk about those in the next sentence. It would have been helpful for them to say whether they were going to be Primaris or Firstborn locked from this. At the moment I'm really not sure that they've clarified it either way, and if I had to guess, I think it would mean that they're probably going to still be locked to either Primaris or Firstborn lines, so it doesn't look like the arbitrary Primaris divide is going away altogether. I kind of wonder if it might be that these are dedicated transports, they're going to have a set unit list that can actually take them. The Land Raider and Repulsor aren't actually dedicated transports, so maybe they need to record what units can go in them on their datasheet perhaps. I guess we'll wait and see though. I think it would have been quite nice to have things like Assault Intercessors and Rhinos, and Stern Guard and Impulsors if he wanted them, but it looks like that might not be the case. Finally though, I did kind of find it interesting that drop pods weren't mentioned in that little list of exemptions. To me that would either imply that drop pods are going to be able to take either Primaris or Firstborn, or just possibly that we might be getting a new drop pod model, and then that will be able to take Primaris anyway. I feel like just dropping a whole load of Hellblasters out of a drop pod seems like quite a good move from a Space Marine army, would be quite a good way to get them into the fight. Overall though, a little bit of progress as to melding the Space Marine ranges back together. I guess we'll find out whether the Rhino, Razorback and Impulsor are restricted to their Firstborn or Primaris targets, or whether they're de-restricted too. Finally, we've got a little trio of faction-specific things. First up, and perhaps most interesting, is the change to the Falcon grav tank. Datasheet abilities seem to be a bit more of a thing in 10th edition than 9th, and this one's gained a rule called fire support, which means that if you get a squad out of the tank, then provided the tank has hit a target with at least one of its guns, you can choose one of the targets and the squad inside will get to reroll all wounds against them. It's really quite a massive damage increase for the unit getting out of the Falcon, to be honest. You could just ping these shuriken catapults into your target of choice, and then maybe let your Fire Dragons or Dire Avengers or whatever absolutely lay waste to them. And what's more, it does appear that it's not just shooting attacks that get buffed in this way, it's also combat as well. Could be absolutely crazy on a Howling Banshees unit, perhaps. Honestly, this one does look like a surprisingly powerful boost for the unit jumping out. It's definitely going to be a pretty meaningful increase if they get out of it, and it looks like this thing will be able to deliver an absolutely enormous alpha strike, zooming forward with good movement, getting the squad out and allowing them to shoot, and having the squad's damage output being crazily more powerful on the first turn that it jumps out. Will be interesting to see whether or not it also retains that drop pod style cloud strike rule that it has at the moment. I perhaps wouldn't be too surprised if this winds up replacing it, but in any case it does look like Falcon tanks could actually be surprising force multipliers for damage output for the fragile Eldar units. Otherwise, just a small preview for the Imperial Guard, just to confirm that the Chimera will still get the mobile command vehicle rule, so officers can issue orders from within it. Quite flavourful and true to the lore, so nice to see that it's still there. And we did know that the Guard would still be getting orders as one of their special things, though no really big details as to how much that's changed so far. Finally, we've got one last little Orky preview. The Orc Mek does seem to have got significantly better. They talk about him buffing a battle wagon and basically amping up the firepower of all the orcs inside, and it does look like the Orc Mek might well be gearing up to be a mini Tech Marine now. He basically has the same things that a Space Marine Tech Marine can do currently. The model previewed is the Mini Mech, the one that's currently in the Elite's Choice section of the Codex, though I guess that restriction won't matter one way or the other now. And this is the Mechaniac rule, which means that you'd probably have this on big mechs as well, just the same. Just like current Tech Marines, he makes one Orc vehicle +1 to hit and can regen D3 lost wounds per phase. In particular, the +1 to hit could be absolutely ludicrous in terms of power if Orcs do still keep their ballistic skill of 5+ into 10th. If they do, then that would just be an enormous +50% damage increase. So if you could target that on a big battle wagon full of a whole bunch of things shooting inside, that could be fairly massive. That plus the repairs together does look like it's kind of powerful, to be honest. Could be worth a fair few points even if he was pointed quite expensive compared with now. And it would still be good if, say, Orky Ballistic still did wind up going up to 4+ for whatever reason. Still looks like it would have value. So anyway, that's just about it for transport rules. I'd say for the most part I really quite like these ones. One of the better 10th edition previews in my opinion, quite detailed, and most of the changes make a lot of sense. I quite like the transports are a lot better at adding a bit of speed, particularly for units wanting to jump out and shoot. Assault Ramp seems very nice to actually make Land Raiders kind of relevant again, and whether or not they have actually de-restricted all Space Marine transports to be Primaris or Firstborn, it still looks like it could be a big step in the right direction. I'll be interested to hear your guys' takes though. Are there any other big implications I might have missed from this? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new stuff just about every day. 10th edition has certainly given me enough to talk about. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, then I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's how I can afford to keep on making videos like this quite so regularly as the main thing that I do. If you have been enjoying the videos quite a bit and you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description, and channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.